Hi, and welcome back to the panel room. Tonight, we're letting everybody put on your gas mask, your body armor, and we're here to talk about the fun and joy of once civilization collapses. Tonight, we're here to talk about apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction. But before we dive into all the fun, let's find out who has decided to join our little tribe. So, Rachel, you are up first.
Awesome. I'm Rachel A. Brune, and I'm an author, and I'm also a horror publisher. I run Crone Girls Press, and I'm also an avid reader of apocalyptic fiction and post-apocalyptic fiction because, why not?
Scott?
Hi, I'm J. Scott Coatsworth, and I write science fiction, sci fantasy, and a bit of magical realism. In my post-apocalyptic stuff, it tends to be strangely like hopeful post-apocalyptic fiction, where like some good things start to happen after a lot of bad shit happens. So, yeah, that's me.
Jenny?
Hi, I'm Gini Koch. I write the Alien Catherine Kitty Cat series for Dog Books. I also write in every length and genre and under a variety of pen names. And as A.E. Stanton, I write post-apocalyptic fiction set in the far future, but in an Old West setting.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott with Jeannie Adams. I write the Outcast Station science fiction / space opera series. I also write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books and independently publish a couple of subgenres of romance.
Berta?
My name is Berta Platas, and I am writing a fantasy series with Nancy Knight. The pictures are right there. But I also have written a 7-book young adult urban fantasy series set in a Renaissance fair that was very popular. And I'm now writing something that has to do with this topic.
Lola?
My name's Lola Lariscy. I'm a writer, and I have written some zombie stories. And let me tell you, it was way before The Walking Dead came out. So now I'm like, zombies, whatever. But I was there first before anyone else in the world ever. Or anyone else, but before The Walking Dead.
Rebecca?
I'm Rebecca Zanetti. I write thrillers and romances. I've written about 70 books, and I do have a post-apocalyptic series called The Scorpius Syndrome that has, I think, 6 books and 4 novellas in it.
Let's start by just kind of defining how you guys look at the apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic genres, which ones you like to work in, and what are the aspects that you like about being able to tell stories in that kind of a world? So, Rachel, I'm going to throw that one at you first.
I think the appeal is that you can explore how human beings interact with each other in a setting that's unfamiliar, but still within a potential reality. And by that, I mean, I know that there's a lot of fiction out there that's like kind of ecstatic. Oh, it's the apocalypse. Now we can just be who we really want to be. When I think of the apocalypse, about the only good thing I see really happening is student loan debt going away. But I think that's it. Is it gives authors and it gives readers a place to play around with some major what ifs. And I think we all kind of wonder inside, what would we do? How would we react if something world-ending or world-changing did happen?
Scott, how about you?
Yeah, I think for me, I see it as an opportunity to kind of reset things. Like you said, the student loan thing kind of in jest, but there's so much in our world that is just broken and stuck right now. And it sometimes feels like something big is going to have to happen to shift things. So a lot of what I write about is in that post-apocalyptic world, how things have shifted and things are maybe improving now after a terrible period because there's been a chance to think about how things could be different.
Jenny?
I think one of the reasons I know one of the reasons I write it, and I think one of the reasons people read it, is that the worst has happened, but look, there's still people around. The story, you're following a story of people who are surviving in some way, which is at its core a hopeful thing. And I know we're talking about this pre-show, and I know we're going to get to it, but I think one of the advantages is you can choose to make your post-apocalyptic fiction hopeful as opposed to despondent. And I think that there's a lot of freedom within there in what you want to create and how you want to create it.
Nancy?
I think I like it because it's a test for the characters. Depending on how close to the apocalypse the story is set, they could have very little to work with, nothing to work with, or new systems to work with. And so it gives you a lot of room to play. And it also puts more of an emphasis on character. It's like who people are is what they behave like. They don't feel as much need to put on a civilized face. And I mean, to me, an apocalypse is a crash of civilization in a wide enough area that people can't come to your rescue. It doesn't have to be worldwide, but it has to be wide. And so what I enjoy about reading it and about the one that I'm working on is how do people react and how do they cope? And is that a world I would like to live in? So naturally, I root for the people who want to create the kind of world I would like to live in.
Berta?
Well, I always imagine myself as a person who will survive when actually I'll probably be one of the first out. But it's great to read these stories and see, what people do, right? These great obstacles that need to be overcome, and then give the characters the smarts or just the dumb luck to overcome them.
Lola?
I do love the clean slate, like everybody said, but I'm also a horror junkie. So I like it when there's horror in it. I like to write horror. I like the feeling that something impending, something is impending, and you're laying out the foreshadowing to show that something's coming, and whatever it is, it's going to be big because this is the apocalypse. It's going to be a dragon. I don't know what it's going to be. It's going to be a vampire. It's going to be a zombies, although I'm tired of zombies at this point. But, it's going to be something really scary, and you get that in your hands, and you get to lay out when that's going to happen. And it's just really exciting.
Rebecca?
Well, tension and conflict lead to character. So you can't find more tension and conflict than, an apocalyptic situation. So I think it opens up a lot of avenues to reveal your characters. And if you put it in a context of a romance, how does anybody fall in love and plan a future when there may not be one? So it's a pretty great challenge. And I think it's a lot of fun to do that. It's all about the characters for me, and that creates a good situation to show who they really are.
Yeah, it's a good question. How do you build an apocalyptic romance?
Right?
Oh, wait, never mind. We've seen that on Jerry Springer. Sorry. So, Scott.
Is he still around?
I have no idea. So, when we're talking about and looking at a good apocalypse, if you're trying to craft a story, because, I think as everybody hit on pretty well, the fun part about post-apocalyptic is you get to create new and kind of creative challenges to force people to survive and go through. But there's also that balance of how do you make sure that there's enough people around so that there's characters to torture? However, at the same time, how do you do something that is going to create the environment to create the kind of conflicts you want to? I mean, because we can face things that are much more realistic, close to where we're at. I mean, it can be something as simple as a financial apocalypse that just wipes everybody out. Or maybe we're looking at an EMP, a nuclear type event. We're looking at a Carrington style event, or maybe even war, pandemics, all the kind of stuff that we see plenty of. Or maybe we get into the more fantastical side of things where it is the alien invasion. It is the looking at the zombie apocalypse because somebody spilled the wrong vial in the lab. How do you decide what do you want to use? And how do you create that setup so you know how quickly you're going to take a lot of people out? Because that is part of the genre, is a pretty heavy body count. But how do you decide what it is to kind of meet that? What do you like to play with? So, Scott?
Yeah, it varies. I think in mine, I tend to kind of sidestep that a lot because I skip ahead a bit. And so you kind of get like the post-apocalyptic period where there are more people kind of come back up. I did one that was my post-zombie apocalypse Christmas romance, which was basically everybody was gone as far as this one guy knew. And then it turned out there was one other guy. And of course, what are the odds that they're both gay, but they are. And, you do kind of find out through the story that there are maybe a few other people left. So in that one, I decided it had to be something deadly enough and fast acting enough that it would basically wipe out everybody. Because if we've seen in this current time period that doesn't always happen. There's a lot of folks get sick, but you don't have everybody get it all at once, and you can take precautions. So it does have to be something, if you really want to wipe everything out, it's got to be something fast, and it's got to be something really big. So that's kind of the route I went with. That one was something that was just infectious enough that it would take pretty much everybody out, and a couple of people have to be immune.
Jenny?
Well, like Scott, I think there's post-apocalyptic, which is right after, and then there's post-post. And I tend to do post-post, just like Scott does, because I already know what happens. I show you the start of what it starts, and then we're like 200 and some years in the future, where humanity is reset. My apocalypse is by the time that this hits, everybody's living in domed cities except for criminals and the poor, or people that are deemed unworthy. And there's a massive solar flare, and it just slags everything, and very bad things happen. So it's the cast-offs that rebuild humanity, basically. And that one of the reasons why I could do it in an Old West setting is that the Old West was probably that was right. You still had to be rugged, you still had to do this stuff, but we had no industrial age, we had no technology, we had nothing like that. So it's pretty easy to regress to that level. You can make a gun, you can smith iron, you can make bullets, but you can't necessarily recreate a computer. And my people don't want to. They're afraid of whatever that was that happened before the darkening. They don't want it again because they know it destroyed. They don't know what it was anymore, but they know it destroyed. And so I have people who are fighting to survive in the new world order, where there is some good and there's a lot of brutality, just like the West was. I'm an Old West expert, so it was fun to take all of that, put that into a post-apocalyptic. But it's got a hope. My characters are the heroes, but they're not necessarily riding in on a white steed with a lance, because that just doesn't happen anymore. But they are trying to survive and rescue people as they can and find a better life.
Nancy, how about you?
Well, like I said earlier, to me, an apocalypse needs to crash civilization. And the project that I'm working on is a near future project. It's not post-apocalypse in the sense that it's, like Jenny said, a couple hundred years in the future. It's probably about 50, 60 years post-apocalypse. And I do think you need something that's going to wipe out a large number of people. And one of the things that I've been wrestling with in creating this world is, how much infrastructure do I want to have left? How much should I take away to make this really difficult? And yet, do I want to leave some that I can use? For example, like maybe the BBC is still on the air. Maybe 1 hour a day or 1 hour every Tuesday, you get the BBC, and how much do they really know? So I think it's kind of deciding backwards, how much of a test do you want to provide for the characters? And also, with every book, I have to figure out, where am I going to end up with this? What's the end goal of this story? And for me, with this post-apocalyptic setting, it's even more important, because how much do I want restored at the end? And I do think, you didn't ask me this, but this is one of the things that has bothered me about a couple of things I've read, is that people need to make their path through their own choices. Coincidence once in a while, okay. Luck once in a while. Inconsistency and choices that we are assured will turn out fine, when in fact there's no logical reason for assuming this will turn out fine, is just a do not finish for me. And I just wanted to slide that in there, because this book that I read not so long ago that did all those things was just on my brain with this panel. So that's...
I want to say that's true for everybody, to be honest.
True.
Yeah.
Berta?
I'm writing a cozy mystery set 20 years after the end of everything. And that cozy implies, seaside town and budge and bodies. But in mine, it's after a terrible disease, there's not a lot of people left. And even though it's not like an EMP that destroys electricity and everything, the people who were left who knew how to run those things are gone. So everybody's been shot back into the early 19th century, and they're having to figure out how things were done a long time ago. So there's not a lot of time to mess around and think about the future. They're just trying to survive. And when an important person of the community dies, then it becomes really important to figure out who did it. And then also, what do you do when you catch the murderer? Because that person is probably also a very important part of the community. So nothing. It's a hard choice. So it's fun to figure out all of these issues and how much, like Nancy said, how much is left afterwards? Walmart? No, that's not coming back. But maybe railroads will come back, or maybe Rachel says she needs a refresher on the question. Yeah, we wandered away from the question.
Like that's ever happened before with this group.
I'm enjoying the conversation.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear what folks are struggling with as they write their stories and what they're thinking of. It's really interesting because there are so many ways to cook this soup. There's so many ways to do it.
Well, and to me, part of the big important question, because again, this is what sets up the conflicts. I mean, it's all about creating the environment and the setup, and often the apocalypse or the environment you're in is a character into and of itself. So when you're doing that, how do you go about getting to that point where you say, I've created enough of an apocalypse, but I can still have some characters around to do things? Mm-hmm. And that's really the thing to me, that is, how do you structure that? What is the research that goes into that? How do you decide what is left? And, I think like Nancy says, sometimes it's, well, I need these things to be left to progress the story. But, it's a little bit of that, making that kind of decision. What do you create as the event to then create the next level of setup?
There's I forget the series, but Gail Z. Martin and Larry Martin.
Wasteland Marshals.
Yes. I really enjoy that series a lot. And one of the things that I enjoyed about their approach was they didn't have one tragic event that stopped that. It was just this series of things that just happened. And I liked that approach because it felt to be very realistic. Because if you do look around, a lot of times if I'm writing something, and one story in particular in my short story collection, Side Roads, I was to me, that was a really interesting idea, that once you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, because if you look around the world and you kind of follow the news, which I understand not everybody wants to do, there's tiny apocalypses happening every day. Whether through war or famine or economic, all of these things are happening. And so we can look, and if it's, and when we're writing our fiction, we just kind of extrapolate it to be worldwide. So when their approach was, it wasn't a big, huge event. It was just a series of everyday tragedies that led to the collapse of what was in place. And I just really appreciated that approach, and then I appreciated how it influenced the characters who were trying to live, because sometimes when there's not a defined trauma, it can be even harder to get through and process it, if that makes sense.
So Lola, how about you?
Well, I like all of these setups. I've always, as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the concept of uncanny valley. People who are like us, but not like us. Soylent Green is people, things like that. They're not quite right. you know. And so that's probably why I gravitated to zombies early on and vampires, although I'm kind of waiting on vampires a little bit. But I just love the concept that the people are still here. They're just not people anymore. There's something very chilling about that. Because how do you deal with that? You can't reason with something like that. All you can do is fight, and there's a good chance you'll lose. So it's inherently terrifying.
Rebecca?
Well, that's the main question for any book, right? It doesn't matter on the genre. Why is this book starting right here, right now? So what's the inciting incident and what is happening? And so for me, when I decided to write a post-apocalyptic, it was, okay, what do my characters need to be able to survive and make this a story? And what do I want to take away to give them struggles? And so I thought I was post-apocalyptic, but in listening to everybody, I guess I'm just post-apocalyptic. I mean, my story starts pretty much still when the problem is occurring, when the bacteria has taken over the world. So that just required a whole lot of research. What would happen to, our electricity if 99% of the people are gone? How long would we have water? And so one of the things I found really interesting is I watched this documentary, and it had the smartest people supposedly in the world. There are like 9 of them from different countries. And they were asking, okay, what could happen to us? And when these people were answering, every single one of them said, when it happens, and not one of them said if. So at that point, I just started writing and also stocking up on Neosporin.
Was that Life After People?
That sounds right. I watched so many of them, but yeah, I went and that's where the main guy ends up getting a little cut at the end and dies. So I have stacks of Neosporin to this day.
That's the smart thing. Good for you.
So one of the things that I have done a fair amount in my professional life and career is I've spent a lot of my time looking at business continuity, DR, disaster preparedness. I've had to do disaster recoveries in a lot of different environments. And the idea of what we do and look at to prepare for a particular kind of incident, because you can't prepare for everything short of if you have enough money and you're in a bunker, and even that's not going to carry you in certain circumstances. But if you're looking at that kind of preparedness versus people who are not prepared, because again, you are looking at certain circumstances. So, I mean, we could consider things like the wars currently going on. Those are definitively apocalyptic to the people that are in those locales in a war zone. We definitively can look at many areas with famine and things like that today. We can even look at some of the things that are building. So if you were in that state, what do you do if you're thinking about your characters that are or thought they were preppers and prepared for everything and they were ready for everything? So if you're building that kind of a character, or do you have the ones that thought everything would always be fine and then all of a sudden find that they aren't? What kind of characters do you like to build and put into this environment? Especially if you've got the ones that are there that are the post-apocalyptic, they may not have even been born in the before times, as we could say. So, Jenny?
I want to make a point about Y2K that has nothing to do with this, but for me had everything to do with it. I was working at IBM during all the Y2K prep, when they realized, oh my God, every computer worldwide is going to slag. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of brouhaha about, did IBM create this, and the other computer companies go along with it. And the government took a mainframe computer and kept it in a locked basement in, I think, the Pentagon. And it stayed not fixed. And on January 1st, 2000, at 12:01, it slagged unbelievably. So I was on the preparedness team, if you will. Everyone in IBM was. We were all, in one way, shape, or form, you were supporting Y2K during those years. So the preparedness team can only be as good as everybody else allows them to be. if IBM and the rest of the big computer companies had not been able to convince world governments that this was a bad thing, and no one had thought about it because in the 1960s, 2001 was science fiction. It wasn't even something anyone was thinking about. They hadn't been able to convince them. We'd already have had an apocalypse. Every computer worldwide would have slacked. So with that knowledge, okay, you can prep, but if you're the only prepper, some of us are old enough, maybe only me, to remember The Day After, which was the big anti-nuke movie. Remember that? It didn't matter how prepped you were, right? There was a family that was prepped, and people came in and killed them for their stuff. So I don't think you can prep. And I'm with Berta. It's one of those things that's like, yeah, everybody thinks they're going to survive the zombie apocalypse. I'm like, I've seen you people park. Okay. I've seen you people drive. I've seen you people unable to return a shopping cart to the corral. Yeah, you're not making it out. Okay. You're not doing it. And I think the only people that have a shot in something big are very far removed, which was why when I did mine, the people that survived the original thing, they are outcasts from society, and they are far away from the big enclosed cities. So what happens, it affects them, but not in the same way as it affects all those other people. So I'm really, I think, great, all you preppers out there. You know, I'm allergic to Neosporin, but like Rebecca, I have a lot of stuff that I'll say because I don't want to ever run out. But the reality is having seen that if the prep people try to prepare can't convince everybody else, they're going to be as SOL as the rest of us. So I think that answered the question.
Nancy?
I think that was really good answer, that the prep people can't really prepare if they can't convince everybody else. The backstory for the characters in my novel, which is the first of a trilogy, would be that as it became apparent that things were getting worse and worse, they would have started trying to prepare and get the people in their neighborhood to amass food, think about defenses, think about communal living. But if you can't convince everybody, if you can't convince a critical mass of people, then you're out of luck anyway. One of my favorite post-apocalyptic novels is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And this is post-apocalypse due to climate change. It just doesn't rain in California. And I forget who had that song about it doesn't rain in Southern California, but it's not raining in Southern California. And the heroine has a friend who tells her to prepare because everybody's living in little enclaves in the LA area. And it's walled enclosures. They're raising small animals to eat. They're using a barter system. But they're saying, you know, like Jenny said, killed them for their stuff. Sooner or later, people are going to come for your stuff. And so the heroine has a go bag packed on this person's advice, and people come for the stuff. And this is a world in which the fire department doesn't put out your fire unless you pay them. The police are not going to come help you because your enclave has been invaded. You're on your own. And she realizes that things don't go well for her enclave, but she's able to get out with her pack. And then the question becomes, how do you decide who to trust? Which is a whole different panel question. But I think unless you are a serious prepper who believes that the apocalypse is around the corner, when you see an apocalypse rolling toward you, for example, maybe you're lucky and you can still find 8 packs of toilet paper. But for a lot of people, it's going to be too late to start preparing at that point.
Berta, anything you want to add on that one?
I'm very sad. I think that Nancy's right. By the time people realize it's too late, and there's a reason why a lot of post-apocalyptic stories have to deal with a loner or somebody who's become alone or separated from their family. Because if you've got 3 kids and 2 big dogs, how are you going to get them the heck out of town? It's going to be very hard. If you have an 89-year-old father, how are you going to get him out? It's just, impossible, and you don't want to roll over and die, but how do you make the best for those people? I know that if it looked really grim in the Atlanta suburbs and I tried to talk my neighbors into growing corn, the HOA would come and fine me for that,
Right.
because you can't grow corn in your front yard. And that's the only place I have sun. So there's a lot of things that keep you from having success if you try to be a prepper. And the least of it is the guy down the street with the gun who's going to come and take all your stuff. There's a lot of other things that go wrong.
Lola, I know
See, I
you're going to
already-
be gleeful at this one.
Well, I already know I'm not going to survive. I am so complacent. I'm sitting here drinking my beer, and I'm like, if I don't have coffee creamer in the morning, coffee and coffee creamer, I'm in a very unhappy mood. And, I like knowing that I have food that's, I didn't have to grow or kill or whatever. And I wouldn't even know how to kill. I had a freak out in Girl Scouts when they wanted me to clean a chicken. And I was like, no. And I ran out screaming. So I already know I'm going to die. Maybe that's why I enjoy writing all this stuff, because I get to pretend for a little while, but I'm not that person. I'm not the person who, I want a blankie because I'm cold. And, I keep my air on, 68 degrees when I'm hot. So I like to pretend that I'm not that person. I'm the Marlboro woman and I will survive everything. But yeah, I wouldn't.
Rebecca.
Well, I mean, as a writer, I want people to read my books. So whatever my characters have prepared for, something else has to happen. Something they're not prepared for, to make it interesting and add tension. As a reader, I like to root for these characters. So I do have a lot of hope that the human spirit will come forth and they'll meet these challenges and humanity will survive. Otherwise, I personally don't want to read the book. I mean, that's me. I need to know there's at least a possibility of survival and a happy ending sometime down the line. So, I look at it both ways. But as a writer, you throw everything at your characters you can. And a reader, you hope. So combine the two, and that's what I write.
Rachel?
So I when I'm writing, and in particular the one story that I'm thinking about, originally it's in the post-apocalyptic, so it's like the next generation. And the setup is that this enclave was put together by someone who was in the military because they had the hierarchical structure. And so they were able to basically tell people, this is what we're going to do. And people did it. And then, boom, they survived. And now they're mired in bureaucracy. And that's actually what ends up getting the hero on her way out the door. But for me, it's really important to take into the human factor, because human beings react in different ways to different things. And when I'm putting together these things, a lot of times I'm using the experience of 9/11, of being in the city, of having something like that happen, and just like for a long period not knowing what to do, because all of the normal ways of getting out of the city were gone. We couldn't go on the bridge. We couldn't go. The buses weren't running. We couldn't go in the tunnels. It was, a full day of not knowing what to do. Communications were barely working. Luckily, one of the lucky things for me is I was working in the city with my dad. He was across town, and so I had some place to go and connect with somebody, and then eventually things got, the local government or the New York City government got the trains going. And so we took a train into upstate New York, and my mom came and got us. So a lot of times when I'm thinking about, okay, whatever sort of event is happening, how would the local government be communicating? Is it going to be cell towers will still work for a little while? Or is it going to be, truckers with CB radios are the only ones who are going to be able to be passing information on? And do people still have ham radios? I don't even know. So it really is, for me, the question of how are people communicating, and how does the government react, and are people going to eventually be able to get back on their feet, or are they going to be walking across those bridges, because you don't want to be hanging around in New York City in the apocalypse, because soon the only thing that's going to be available to eat are rats.
Scott?
So I want to answer this in kind of a roundabout way. And it's not to me necessarily so much about the particular people that survive and why they survive. There was a great play we saw here in Sacramento a few years ago called Mr. Burns. And the play, the idea of it was, if you look back, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's annoying. Spam. If you look back a couple hundred years, what do we still have in our culture that survived from that time? We've got Shakespeare, we've got Beethoven. If you look forward, what's going to survive past an apocalypse? What parts of the culture will still survive? And the writer's answer to this was The Simpsons. And so they had basically this group of people that kind of came out of some unspecified apocalypse. They never really told you exactly what had happened, and the characters didn't really know exactly what had happened. But they gathered around a campfire, and they started just talking and kind of making connections. And they started talking about episodes of The Simpsons and what they remembered of them. And it kind of evolved into this thing where there were troops, as it kind of jumped forward in time, of Simpsons actors, and they were recreating the shows from the little bits and pieces of the dialogue that people could remember from them. And they would actually pay people to give them a little bit of the show that they remembered so they could fill it in. And so they had recreated all these different episodes of shows and produced them. And it became this whole, like, the linchpin of their culture was reenacting these Simpson episodes from the time when things used to be normal. And, it took on a whole life of its own. So to me, a lot of it in these stories, especially when you get post-apocalyptic, is what's going to survive of our culture, and how recognizable will that be? Like if we're reading it as a reader and we know what it is in our time, what's it going to look like 100 years from now when we're looking at it through the lens of this, post-apocalyptic culture?
Yeah, and that kind of goes one of the places I wanted to go, which is that idea of how do you decide what culture looks like after all things are said and done? Because again, this is part of the things that we read for, is what are the characters doing and why? And I think that, going back to like Lola's point, one of the things that has kept the interest in The Walking Dead is not only who dies this week, but also looking at the different stressful ways that people find to keep living while the apocalypse is ongoing. And so looking at this idea of culturally, what are we looking at? What's the environment look at? Yeah, I'm going to open this up just a little bit more. Are you more interested in how do relationships form? So in other words, if we're in that early stage, how do people start to come together? Because again, we were talking a little bit before we started about, one of the things we're all tired of is the lone survivor that's out there trying to slog through the wilderness. Because generally, historically, we know if you're alone in the wilderness, you're not going to survive for very long. You may have the Mad Max that gets along and survives for a while, but generally, we're social animals. We're social creatures. We're tribal creatures. We've got to operate as a group, as a social group, because number one, if you get injured, who's going to help take care of you? You can't do all the things that you need to do to create a sustainable agriculture or being able to feed yourself, because hunter-gatherer only works for so long. As we're looking at things going through these phases, how do people that are often going to be from very disparate standpoints come and decide to create a new culture? And how do they decide how that new culture looks? Is it militaristic because maybe it was a former military base and it's still the old commander that's there? Maybe it is somewhere like I'm at, which is very rural right now, out in the countryside with people that probably mostly know each other, have some degree of basis. But if you have a lot of people that are dying from a pathogen or whatever the case may be, you still have a lot of things that are going to create even distrust amongst people that have known each other their entire lives. So Nancy, if you're thinking about the setup, what are the kinds of things that you want to build, and how do you go about structuring what that new culture looks like? How do you go about deciding this idea of trusting or not trusting? How do you go about creating those things of the world that the characters are going to be living in?
Well, when we talk about culture, I think about art and music. And I think music will always survive because you can make music with nothing. I mean, not me because I can't sing, but people who can sing can make music without an instrument or anything like that. But when you look at community, that's one of the things I like about Parable of the Sower, is that the heroine kind of has a reset as she goes on the road, but she begins to acquire other people, and they build a group and a community. And the questions are, what can you contribute to the overall well-being of the group? Can we trust you? And how do we defend ourselves? And one of the books that I thought took 3 really interesting approaches to that was S.M. Sterling's Dies the Fire, because Juniper Mackenzie is a Wiccan and a musician, and an e-impulse destroys the tech doesn't work anymore, including internal combustion engines and firearms. And so she happens to be with people she knows, and they band together and realize they have to get out of the city. And I thought it was really interesting. A panel I went to on the Apocalypse Rising track at DragonCon several years ago said the average city has 3 days worth of food on hand. That's why it gets trucked in constantly. And then the second group in Sterling's book are a family on their way to their vacation home, and their pilot is a Force Recon Marine. And he is able to glide the plane in for a landing when the engine stops working. And then they gradually acquire other people as they move along. And then the family already had property, so they make their way to that property. And then the third one, a guy who was in the Society for Creative Anachronism, establishes a feudal system. And so it's what we all have cultural influences we come from. So I think you decide which ones you want to draw on, which is kind of a long answer to your question, I think.
Berta, how about you? And I'd be really curious, because one of the things you brought up is that idea of, if somebody in your small, close-knit community commits a crime, how do you deal with that? And you're on mute.
My dog came in, and I wanted to make sure nobody heard him.
Okay.
Turn that off. In my group, they're gathering skills, and there are already people who live in the town, and they're not going to boot them out. So these are the people who have been existing, but who else do they let in? And as the hordes of hungry people go by, they have to make some very hard decisions that happened about 10 years in the past. So my protagonist was a young child at the time, and they talk about the bridge battle that happened at an interchange, an overpass at a bridge. They call it the bridge battle. But they had to kill just people like them who were looking for a safe place, but they got aggressive and they got killed. And then, but if you find a dentist, of course you're going to let them in because you need a dentist. And but is it a good dentist, or is it a thieving, murderous dentist? We don't know. It's interesting and fun to play with all that.
So now we know who committed the first murder in the Cozy Mystery. It was the dentist.
It's not the dentist. I don't think I have a dentist. But I do mention that people have been hung in the past. They have found people guilty of thievery and have hung them. But would they hang the town doctor or the only minister in town? Probably not.
Lola, how about you?
I'm looking at one of my old stories. It's called Brains Requested, and it's one of the zombie ones. And the reason that they're even here to talk about is they live up kind of on a hill, because I spent a lot of time in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to college there. And there are plenty of residents up on the hill. You got to trek up there and you overlook the city. It's a whole thing. And so in this story, they live kind of up on a hill. And, the zombies, they don't know how to climb. They're kind of just lumbering around. They don't really get the whole climbing up a mountain type thing. So they're just kind of looking down and watching the zombies lumber by. So I guess that's kind of how I would have my characters be. They would be offset from everybody and being able to look and kind of observe, but not really be a part of it, which is kind of how I live my life anyways. So it works.
Rebecca?
For me, since it was happening much closer to the apocalypse, it was people banding together because they had a common goal, which was survival and beating the bacteria, and they had a common enemy. There's a bad guy and a bad unit. So they kind of formed naturally because they didn't really have a choice if they wanted to survive. Nobody could really survive on their own. And so that created this situation to throw people together, which is always interesting in fiction.
Rachel?
So in the story that I wrote, or novelette, the culture of the enclave that we're focusing on is very hierarchical, very bureaucratic. And basically, the reason for that is because it was started by a military leader, and a military leader though who didn't want a military society. So they did their best to recreate like a democratic town council situation. And I was like, okay, well, if you're too small and you're going through trauma and you don't have a chance to really figure out how you're going to bring in new ideas or think of new things, what's something like if we pushed those concepts to if you push them all the way to as intense as you can make them, what would you get? And what you get, in my book anyway, is just a very, not picture the worst bureaucratic person that you have ever worked with, and then just times that by 10 and add in monsters that are trying to climb the walls to eat you. That's what you get. But I mean, like I said, that was because this enclave came from a very specific place. I've also seen like Station 11,
Yes.
I believe.
I love that show.
Right,
Such a beautiful show.
So I haven't seen the show. I read the book.
Oh, I haven't read the book. I've seen the show. The show made me cry. One of the actors was Emmy nominated, but I want to read the book. Sorry, I got excited.
No, that's okay. I love it. And I love that because it's in that book, it's they try to hold on, like Scott was saying, to something from the before times.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's changed and it's transformed because the apocalypse has happened, it still gives people something to hold on to. It gives them some bit of beauty or art or just escapism that they can take advantage of. And I do think that even in the worst, most terrible place that you could possibly be, those things still exist. That sort of music and storytelling and all of those things that make us just a little bit more human are still going to exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I love this idea about culture after an apocalypse and what's going to happen with it. I feel like in a lot of cases, what would happen is you get the opposite of what the perceived cause of the apocalypse was. And we talked about this a little before. I think a couple of you mentioned that it's going to be a reaction to what happened because we don't want it to happen again. So in my book, Drop Knots, I've got 3 different groups, and one thinks the apocalypse was caused by heathens, and so they've become very religious. One group thinks that it was caused by men, so it's a matriarchal society in their case. And then one group thinks it was fossil fuels that destroyed the world, and so they are, solar punk, steampunk kind of thing going on. There's a show, and I feel badly because my examples are like all visual arts instead of like book arts, but there's a show called C, which is a Jason Momoa's show. And it is just like freaking fascinating because it's after a pandemic, and everybody basically went blind. And this is a few hundred years later. And they've created this whole new society that is everyone is blind. And they've set up everything so that they can get around. They can do crafts. They can do a lot of things. They can't make boats. They can't sail across seas. And then the sighted start to return. People are born with sight. And their whole society is premised on the idea that sight was the evil thing that led to all the other things that caused the apocalypse. So the sighted have to be evil and have to be killed. So it's that whole idea of taking like, what was the cause of it and how can I turn that around and make that into the driving force behind the new culture, the new civilization in the story.
Jenny?
I have a variety of societies in the New West series. They're all, remember, these are people, the prison doors open when everything slags. So there are prison communities, and they are exactly as vicious and horrible as you think they are. But prisons also run on a very strong hierarchy. Whoever's the biggest, baddest guy runs the yard, and that's the case here. So it focuses on, and when Josie comes home, it focuses on Horsetown, because horses really still matter, because you can't make a car work anymore. They are literally they're back in the 1870s, 1880s, in what you can do and what you can get out of the ground, and everything else. So it's farming, it's trade, Horsetown. They sell and barter horses and other livestock, women, for whatever your pleasure. And the women do all the doctoring, and they run the stills, so the best whiskey and things like that. But there are other parts of what these people know as the world, or the world that they can get to. The Omaha farms, which are farmland areas that were untouched because they were, again, the unworthy who dared to still want to actually work the soil. The Kingdom of Texas, for example. It's not all of Texas, but it's this area where there's one charismatic guy who managed to pull everybody together, and that's just, going through a monarchy, and so forth. So there's all these different things that they hit. So culturally, it just depends on where they are for what's going on, but it is still very much of an old West culture, even though they don't know that they're Old West. And to what Scott's point was about, and Rachel's book comes through, I kept the Bible. It's lasted for a couple thousand years. I just figure it's going to last a little bit longer. And so, but reading is not something that's lasted. So I have a hero-heroine combo, and the hero knows how to read. And it's because he is one of the old ways people. They learn to read, they learn to do sums, they know how to farm, they know how to do other things, and he teaches her, and so on. So the culture really depends. When in Deacon's Ark, when they're on a riverboat, that has its own culture as well. The river towns have their own cultures. So just like in the Old West, you could go into one town and everybody's really warm and welcoming. You can get to another and it's get out of here, stranger. We don't want you. So because I think, like everyone else has talked about, I think your people are going to react like people, and people do not react in a uniform manner. So whoever your strongest, biggest, nastiest, most charismatic, you pick your descriptor person is for that area, they're putting their stamp on it, and it's going to get continued on. So that's how I dealt with culture. And because my hero and heroine are traveling, they are travelers, that they will go into all these different cultures, which makes it more interesting.
So we could spend another couple of hours talking about apocalyptic fiction, because how do we blow everything up? But we'll have to do another one. But I've got one last question for everybody. Is we've always got that one thing, we should have talked about X. So this is your opportunity to come up with that. Here's the one thing we didn't talk about we should have. So Berta, you get gotten to you.
Well, we did kind of touch on culture, but if people want entertainment and we think, oh, this is going to be like the Middle Ages where they have troubadours and stuff like that, but actually people are probably going to recreate episodes of The Family Guy and tell each other memes that they used to see online. And that would, that's what everyone's used to. So it would be very sad for culture, and we're going to have to reinvent it another way.
Rachel?
I'm I don't have a really ready answer. I think one of the things that I always want to talk about on post-apocalyptic panels is the idea that when we talk about prepping, when we talk about preppers, a lot of times it's about stockpiling the guns and the heritage seed to be able to protect what you prep. But the other things that you can do to prep, like gathering knowledge, like having your library be like having your how-to books be actual books instead of Kindle books. And
Are you
then,
suggesting the apocalypse that an e-reader may not be the most useful tool?
you
You
know,
can
I
whap
love
someone in the
mine.
head with it, though.
I love mine, but yeah, that's about what you would be able to use it for. So yeah, just the idea that knowledge and libraries might be some of the most valuable resources. And I never really see that explored very well in post-apocalyptic fiction, with possibly the exception of the TV show Jeremiah, which sometimes
That was a good show.
Yeah, I like that show too.
So my heroine is a librarian, and she is, because she keeps all the books, and no one's allowed to take them away. They should be kept in a central location in case something happens to them.
Yep.
Scott, what's the one thing you think that we should have talked about we haven't gotten to?
Well, I was going to say really quickly to Rachel's point, there was a show, I forget what the name of it was, but all the power went out in the whole world all at once. And there was this really cool little subplot about a woman that had pictures of her kids in her phone. And that was the only place she had pictures, and she really wanted to see them. And she finally got to a place that had a little bit of power, and she was able to see them. And it was just this like really poignant like statement of, that's it. Thank you. Revolution. The thing I brought up before we started is there a pre-apocalyptic fiction genre or a group of stories in that genre? What would that look like? Would people read it? Because if you're reading towards disaster, like at least after disaster, it's kind of like, you've already had the horrible thing happen, and now you can have some good little things happen. But is there pre-apocalyptic fiction? What is it, and how viable would that be?
That's the daily news.
I think a lot
Jenny?
Well, I was going to say, to answer Scott's question, I think a lot of pre-apocalyptic it's there and then we save the day. I think in my mind, that's pre-apocalyptic. It's like, the apocalypse is coming, but you managed to avert it. That's kind of, yeah. Woo! I think otherwise, if it's pre, you show the apocalypse. I don't think, and then what might happen, I don't think that's a satisfying end. So yeah, exactly. For me, I think we've touched on it, but my statement is that really, I just kind of want to reinforce this. Post-apocalyptic fiction does not have to look like the wallpaper behind Jim. It can be hopeful. It can be loving. It can be new. It doesn't have to be grim and dark and terrible. The grim and dark and terrible already happened. But it can be uplifting, and I just think we need to reinforce that a little bit so that it's not all doom and gloom. Yes, the worst has happened, but hey, people have survived, and you know what? There's still people, and it's good and it's bad, and they fall in love and they do all these other things.
Nancy?
Endings. We talked a little bit about having a hopeful story, and Jenny was just talking about not having everything be dark and grim. But things can be dark and grim for me if they end on a hopeful note. A lot of people like stories like women's fiction where the heroine goes through all kinds of tragic things and her relationship falls apart, and she realizes that she's doing better on her own and she can stand on her own 2 feet and she doesn't need a relationship. And that's fine. I just don't like stories that end with a character deciding I'm a loner and I prefer it that way. There was a post-apocalyptic novel by a very famous writer, and I looked at it in the bookstore and I thought, this is shelved in literary fiction. I don't know if I trust this. And so I took it off the shelf and I read the last page and I went, I'm glad I didn't spend 2 days getting to this point. And I put the book back. And if that's your jam, knock yourself out. That's great. I mean, we all like different kinds of things, and that's why there are lots of different kinds of books to read. But I want a hopeful ending. I want a hopeful ending that fits the plot, that isn't Deus Ex Machina, and isn't a rosy assumption that in a real world would get you killed. I want an optimistic ending.
Well, guys, I think we pulled together at least a good start for ending the world on a cheerful note. And one of the things I do like that came out of this is the idea that there can be joy and life, happiness, romance after the disaster, because that's one of those things. Because if there isn't life after the disaster, do you really want to survive it anyway? But before we get out of here and head forth into our own apocalypse, what is the plural of apocalypse? If we
Apocalypse.
Where dark side lives, it's really not very pleasant. Don't want to go.
Well, before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to come find your ends of the world. So, Rachel, website, social media, which book do you want to tell everyone about?
So if you're into apocalypses, which is what I've decided the plural will be, check out my short story collection, Side Roads, and the final novelette in that book, And Out Come the Wolves. And you can find that on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited and paperback. And find me on Twitter at Rachel A. Brune, and that's a good place to find all the rest of all of my stuff.
Scott?
So I'm going to just say I'm on jscottcoatsworth.com. So J Scott and coats, like coats or jackets, and worth, like what's it worth. Also J Scott Coatsworth on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, but I mostly just tweet. I don't do a lot of interaction. Two that I'll mention, there's my Zombie Apocalypse Christmas Tale, Wonderland. And I also have another one that's The Last Human Heart, which is a short story that was in Post-apocalyptic that I showed in the group before the thing started. But I'm putting out a new short story collection, which it's going to be in, called Androids, which refers to that story, and Aliens. And that's going to be coming out on December 8th. So that's got 3, I would say, pre-apocalyptic stories, and then the one post-apocalyptic story.
Jenny?
At www.ginikoch.com. I'm on Facebook a lot, both as Gini Koch, Hairspray and Rock and Roll, and author of the Alien Catherine Kitty Cat series. I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Pinterest. Looks like I'm on Instagram. Please stop sending me invitations, because I'm not. I'm there, but I'm never there because I don't know how to work it. And I'm on Pinterest though, so send me funny memes. I love that. My latest release that I keep forgetting to talk about anytime I'm in a new releases panel is Touched by an Alien, which is the first book in my Alien series. It has come out in audiobook, and it's great. I love the narrator, and so please get that wherever audiobooks are sold. And if you are looking for post-apocalyptic fiction, I have a short story in The Dying Planet by Al from Flame Tree, and then my new West series, which is The Darkening, When Josie Comes Home, and Deacon's Ark are the first 3, and they're coming out fairly soon in a collection called The Dawning of the West, but I don't know what the update is on that yet. So you can buy them individually.
Well, we'll have it on Hot Off the Press. I doubt it. Nancy?
You can find me at nancynorthcott.com. I spend the most social media time on Twitter, probably more than is really good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott. My Facebook page is Nancy Northcott Author, and I'm just beginning to get it up and running because Facebook changed everything and I don't understand it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I share Jenny's issues with Instagram. Instagram doesn't like me, so I'm hardly ever there. And I am on Goodreads and BookBub, and occasionally I do show up there, and I'm Nancy Northcott everywhere. And my post-apocalyptic story is at least a year from other humans being able to see it. But there is a pandemic in my colleague Jeannie Adams' story in Welcome to Outcast Station.
Berta?
I'm Berta Platas everywhere, and I mostly hang out on Facebook. And I have an author page that I never go to, and neither does anybody else. They all hang out with my kids and my grandkids and my dogs and my cat. So that's where I am. And I also have a website where I keep a catalog of my books. So because I also wrote a lot of romance early on in my career. But now lately I'm writing this Dragon Shifter series about a young woman who inherits a throne she did not know was hers, and then she has to keep it.
Well, and I want to thank Lola Lariscy and Rebecca Zanetti, who had to drop to go hop on another panel. But I've had the pleasure of being your host as we ended the world tonight, Jim Nettles, and you can, of course, find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the Speculative Fiction Academy, and, of course, here where they never let me out of my cage. So go forth and find your own community, people, because you'll have to survive the coming apocalypse with them. But until then, remember, in the after times, it will be cheerful fun and there will be romance. Night, everybody.